Welcome to everyone as you are joining us and trickling in to our event. We hope you're having the best possible day. Speaking myself in Glasgow, home of COP26, the sun has just come out, which is never a bad thing in Glasgow or in Scotland. You're very welcome to our event. I tried to put the Gaelic word for welcome, which is Bhatia. There you go. That's the only Gaelic word I know. Today, we are going to, oops, let me just get the slide changing working. Today, we are going to tell you a lot about how satellites can make the world a better place. And we are very happy and delighted to have I am delighted to have so many great speakers with us today. My name's Ken Gordon. I am the European Space Agency Business Ambassador for this region. And we will also be hearing from Paul Bhatia, who's also a business ambassador for European Space Agency, Astrid Werkmeister, a space Earth observation expert from Strathclyde University. We've got Sarah Middlemiss from Ecometrica. So we've got a really nice mix of things today. What does European Space Agency do? Well, European Space Agency, Space Solutions, is the biggest innovation network, space innovation network in the world. We support startups and SMEs to develop their businesses using space and space data. And we have funding to help you do that. And the very last thing will be the funding that we talk about. We're focused on helping businesses use space data to make themselves better, to create jobs, and to sustain and support the growing economy. This is the slide that I'm always interested to see how it will run. Of all the money that ESA has and spends, and remembering that the UK is the fourth biggest contributor to ESA, I'm going to be talking mainly about the right-hand column, which is the application of space data and application of space technologies. And assuming that has not broken my internet, yes. So we've invested 200 million in 500 businesses, launched 300 projects, and there's plenty of money left. So if you're sitting there and going, actually, I've got a project, or I've got something developed, but I've never done it, and it uses space technologies, wait, and it's got something to do with climate change. At the end, we'll tell you how you can get up to half of your project funds provided by ESA. Enough about, hold on, slide change has gone very slowly. There we go. Today, we will be talking about, excuse me, using GNSS, GNSS, including reflectometry to measure climate change. We're going to have a short video about how you can see climate change from space. We're going to have a live demo from Ecometrica and Sarah about how their dashboard to measure climate change. And we have then a little tutorial on how you, for free today, could go online and start getting your satellite data to make your own measurements or help your own business or inform your own business. And finally, I'll talk about the funding, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. If you would like to type your questions in the chat, that would be great. As they go, we'll probably answer them all at the end anyway, but as they occur to you. And if, like me, you think of a really good question 48 hours after the event is finished, at the end, there will be all of our email addresses so that you can get in touch. We would hope that is not the last time we speak to you. You're very welcome to engage in dialogue with us, and we'll do our very, very best to help you. Paul Bhatia, that's him. He is an ESA ambassador, also like me, for the Midlands and Northeast, and Paul is an expert on GNSS. And Paul is now going to talk about how you can use GNSS to measure climate change. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks so much, Ken. And it's great to see so many of you here at this event, and what we hope is going to be a series of events. So the second currently in a series of events that we're organizing to talk about satellite applications and ESA funding. So as Ken mentioned, we're colleagues, we work together as part of ESA Space Solutions in the business applications area. And I'm the regional ambassador, as Ken said, for the European Space Agency Business Applications for the Midlands and Northeast in the UK, part of a team of 4 people at the moment, previously 7, hopefully going back up to 7 next year. And we each cover a particular region within the UK, but we all have our particular particular areas of expertise, and you can get in contact with any of us, really. Can you see this dictation on my screen? Okay, I've got rid of that now anyway. Okay, so I'm hosted by the University of Nottingham, where I've been working for about the last 13 years. And as Ken rightly said, that's been in GNSS. So I've been there managing the work of a centre, which is called the GNSS/Geospatial Research Applications Centre of Excellence, part of the Nottingham Geospatial Institute at the University of Nottingham, with a background in surveying and doing a lot of work with GNSS applications and GNSS technologies. So I'm going to talk today about how you can use GNSS to measure things related to climate change. We're only going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, so it's going to be a top level introduction. If there's things that you're interested in here, which hopefully you will be, then do get in touch. So just I mean, we probably all know about satellites. Now we're here, COP26. Well, I'm not, I'm here virtually, sitting in Derby. But why satellites? Well, satellites allow large areas of the Earth to be viewed at once. They're high up in the sky, obviously beyond the atmosphere, looking down from that great distance. And they allow us to collect more data and to collect that more quickly than instruments that are based on the Earth. But also we can use them in tandem with instruments on the Earth to provide better measurements and better information about what's happening to the Earth. And we can use them to zoom in for increased coverage. And there's lots of different sensors on satellites. So we have radars as well as optical payloads that are not that work if there's cloud cover and work if there's night. So obviously there's restrictions and limitations to optical data, but there's all sorts of data that we can get from satellites. They allow us to access data on places that are hard to get to, so we get a holistic view of what's going on, and we can look at things in more detail. They allow us to see what's going on in space as well. So it's great pictures that we see from Hubble, for example. And the bit that you obviously now know that I'm supposed expert in, and the bit that I'm going to concentrate on, they provide super precise timing signals and allow us to position ourselves and navigate anywhere on Earth using something called GNSS. So what is GNSS? Well, if we think about GNSS, GNSS actually stands for Global Navigation Satellite Systems, and the most commonly known system that is a GNSS is GPS, the Global Positioning System, which is in something that we call a medium Earth orbit. And what we have here in this diagram is just showing us where different satellites, if you like, and space vehicles sit in space in relation to the Earth. So the International Space Station is in a low Earth orbit, about 400 kilometers distant. And Sentinel-1, the satellite that you may have heard of, and Astrid is probably going to talk about some of the data coming from that satellite, another low Earth orbit satellite launched by ESA as part of the Copernicus Eyes on Earth program for remote sensing and Earth monitoring, about 700 kilometers away. So this is not a tutorial in satellites, but if we talk about GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, we're talking about constellations of 24 or more satellites, or which what we call a medium Earth orbit, about 20,000 kilometers away, or 2 Earth diameters, if we think about the Earth and we put it into relation with the Earth. And they're currently, in those 24 satellites, ensure that there's always at least 4 visible satellites available on Earth. In order to position ourselves on Earth, we need to be able to see a minimum of 4 satellites. There's currently 4 operational GNSSs, GLONASS, a Russian system, GPS, the most well-known American system, Beidou, the Chinese system, and Galileo, the European system, that we are no longer part of some elements of Galileo, although we can access the open signals from Galileo. And those constellations are supplemented by regional satellites, other low Earth satellites, and other higher orbiting satellites as well. So that's important for what I'm going to be talking about. Right, so I got a little video that started. So that's just picturization there of GPS satellites orbiting the Earth in a constellation, and showing you how they're positioned and just generally what their orbits are. And GNSS, GPS, relies on timing synchronization and ranging. So we need to know where the satellites are, the time that they were, where they were, very, very exactly. And then we range those satellites, so we work out the distance to those satellites, and we can work out where we are on Earth. We synchronize the time, if you like, in very simple terms. And that gives us very, very precise time, because GNSS, GPS satellites have atomic clocks on board, and those most precise timing signals that you can get, nanoseconds, so accurate to a billionth of a second in terms of the timing that they provide. And by using GNSS, we know we kind of understand the limitations from our phones and positioning, and when GPS doesn't work. But using special techniques and special parts of the signal called the carrier phase, we can get down to millimeter levels of accuracy and positioning. And we talked about 4 different systems. The key thing there is that those systems all have signals that are interoperable, that are free to receive signals, and they have multiple uses, including climate change monitoring, which is what I'm going to focus on today. But first, just to say that, hopefully you know this, I don't have to say it, GPS, GNSS technology is ubiquitous nowadays. It's everywhere and it's everything. The technology is being miniaturized, it's getting very, very power efficient, and we use it without even realizing that we're using it most of the time. It's what makes our smartphones smart, because the smartphones know where we are and can relay that information using comms. And it's integrated, GNSS technology is integrated into specialist equipment as well as everyday equipment, such as smartphones, vehicles, structures, utilities, providing assistance, control, and monitoring, providing so many social, humanitarian, and economic benefits. So, for example, it makes vehicles more fuel efficient because we know where we're going, we have better use of routes, and it allows us to embed power and control, for example, through electric vehicles. It's used because of the timing signals to synchronize and optimize power grids. And for example, some of the uses that we probably take for granted now, the optimization of vehicle routing for aircraft, air traffic, ships, smart ports, port operations, and logistics. So GNSS as a technology, through the applications of GNSS, are really contributing to how we're helping to control the climate. So how does it work? Well, all elements of a GNSS system are constantly communicating. So we have something called the ground segment, the user segment, and the space segment. The space segment are the satellites, the control segment or ground segment are those receiver stations that are constantly communicating with the satellites, and the user segments are the receivers that receive the signals that we use to process time and navigation and location data. And there's various bits of data there that we need in order to be able to understand where the satellites are, how we use that data. And that's very, very important. So every receiver, GPS receiver, GNSS receiver, has something called Middlemiss data and Almanac data, which tells you where all of the satellites are, how the satellites are performing, and what the delays are. And that's really important to understand how GNSS works. And then that basically is augmented by correction data from the satellites as they pass overhead, or terrestrial communication networks that then are used to really improve the quality of the position. Okay, so that's as far as I'm going to go on this, although I say GNSS is a very low power signal and it's affected by the atmosphere. When I say the atmosphere, it's particularly affected by the ionosphere, which is obviously electrically charged, and the troposphere, which is producing all sorts of weather systems, and they produce delays on the delivery of the signals from the satellites to the receivers. And because we know where all these satellites are and what they're doing through the Middlemiss and Almanac data, and that's constantly updated, and because we can then model these delays, understand what these delays are, and use those delays to understand what is happening in the atmosphere and down on the Earth, which allows us to use GNSS for scientific climate change applications. So I'm going to talk about two scientific uses of GNSS, both quite advanced, and I've only got a short time to talk about it. I'm not a massive expert on them, so I can only talk top level anyway. And they use the basic principles of GNSS to provide very, very powerful remote sensing tools. Like I said, this can be basic introductions. So what I'm introducing here is something called the British Isles Continuous Monitoring GNSS Facility. It's something that the University of Nottingham manage on behalf of the Natural Environment Research Council, NERC. And it's been running for many, many years. And it's based on a series and network of what we call geodetic. So geodetic, very, very powerful fixed GNSS receivers, which are very high grade, high sensitivity receivers. And there's about 115 of those permanent stations, which are operated by the Ordnance Survey around the UK. And you can see the positions of those on that map that's on this slide. And that data is collected at very, very high frequency. So 1 cycle per second, in some cases, 1 signal per 30 second, and archived for all of those stations around the UK. These particular data sets are available for researchers. So for research purposes, as long as you accredit Big F, you can access this archive of signals which are measured for all of those stations around the UK. And what do we measure? Well, we measure any GNSS signal that we can get hold of. So that includes all the GNSS signals that I mentioned, and we measure dual frequency. So we have multi-frequency measurements of GNSS, which means we can do lots and lots of different scientific experiments with it and understand what is happening. If you remember what I said about the troposphere and the ionosphere. And what you can see on the left-hand side there is an example of the time series of information that's collected from one of those stations. And as you can imagine, those stations are actually the UK is moving as well, for the UK and how it's shifting. Kind of the nether regions of Scotland are kind of shifting down, well, are shifting up, and the south of the England, as we know, kind of areas of Norfolk are going to be covered in water. So these stations are measuring actually motion of land up and down as well. And then what we have on the right-hand side there, I mentioned tropospheric delays. There is a measure of tropospheric activity. We call it zenith time delay. That's a technical term for it that allows us to measure the amount of moisture in the air. And actually these models fill directly into the Met Office. And when you look at those maps on the BBC weather or ITV weather, whatever you watch nowadays moving across the UK, this is because these models are updated very, very rapidly and allow us to understand what the moisture levels are in the air and predict rainfall. So obviously those models taken over long periods of time allow us to measure integrated water vapor, which allows us to measure what's happening in terms of the levels of global climate change. And we input those into global climate models. So there you can see a model that's taken from ESA. It's on a site called Navipedia, which is a site which is dedicated to navigation, and all things GNSS are on there. That explains a lot of the terms in great detail about GNSS. And you can see there the linear trends for 42 global GNSS stations. So like those stations I showed you for the Ordnance Survey Network for that period of time, and showing how things are changing, getting less wet, more wet. So fantastic indicators of climate change there. Right, so now I'm going to talk about reflectometry. Reflectometry is basically an Earth observation technique. So we think of Earth observation from satellites like the Sentinels and whatever, but GNSS is actually provides a very, very powerful Earth observation tool as well. And what we measure is we look at reflected GNSS signals. So I'll explain that in a little detail in a minute. And the reflection of those GNSS signals from the Earth's surface depends on the roughness and also the properties of the surface. So we can measure, based on those properties, what are the characteristics of the surface, but also what is the change in height of the surface. We can do that for water, we can do that for land, we can even do it for soil in terms of understanding levels of soil moisture. And I talked about the satellites that augment GNSS constellation. So in this case, we have passive low Earth orbit satellites, and we know more and more that what is great about low Earth is it's cheaper to get into space, they're lower cost, and they give you a better ground repeat, so high temporal resolution. Right now, there's public data available from TechDemoSat-1 and also from NASA's Cygnus. And a project we're working on right now is this ESA Scout mission, which is called Hydro GNSS, which is specifically looking using GNSS receivers on low Earth orbit satellites to measure soil moisture levels. So I had to go into a little bit of detail to explain what's happening with GNSS for reflectometry, but happy to kind of talk about this offline in more detail for people who are interested. We all know, well, we don't know, but obviously there's companies like Spire who are putting GNSS receivers onto low Earth orbit satellites and using them for GNSS reflectometry to measure climate change and understanding what's happening at the Earth's surface. More data is coming, and these applications, as I've mentioned, include ocean roughness, ocean wind speed, soil moisture, permafrost extent, sea ice extent, and vegetation cover. So hopefully I've kind of told you something that you didn't know, that you can use GNSS for measuring climate change as well. And there are very, very good and detailed scientific ways that you can use that data. And that data is available for you to collect for free, and archive data is there as well. So very quickly and basically, how does that work? Well, we have the medium Earth orbit satellites, the GNSS satellites, 20,000 kilometers away in the case of GPS, that are beaming signals continuously down to the Earth in the L-band frequency range, so microwave frequency range, about 1.5 gigahertz, so 1.5 gigahertz cycles per second. And in terms of that, we've got those signals which are being beamed directly to the Earth and then reflected from the Earth. So essentially what we have on these satellites on low Earth orbit is traditional GNSS antennas on the top of the satellite and special antennas on the bottom of the satellites that have been configured to pick up the reflected GNSS signals. So the technicality of that, for those who want to know that, is that the signals that are emitted from the satellites are right-hand circularly polarized, and the signals that bounce off the Earth are mirrored. So the antennas on the underside of the satellites are left-hand circular polarized, so they can collect those signals and differentiate between them. And obviously, if they're underneath, they're picking the signals that are reflected from the surface of the Earth. So what do we do? So essentially, the LEO satellite, as I said, has two antennas, one that receives signals directly from the satellites and special antennas on the underside of the satellites that receive those reflected signals from the surface of the Earth. The recorded delays between the signals recorded at both antennas is what is used to determine changes in surface height and surface moisture levels. Well, it's a lot more, there's a lot more to it than that. It's a lot more complicated. That's why these are scientific missions, but that's the basic technology of how it works. So what are we doing with Hydro GNSS? The satellite mission that I mentioned. So that's now specifically looking at soil moisture as one of the things that it's doing, and highly accurate retrievals are possible. We can process a lot of data over a 24-hour period, and this technology, as it develops, will be used for industrial applications such as environmental monitoring, crop management, and the technology is already used in these areas as well. And as I mentioned, there's already private companies that are developing the systems, and obviously there's a lot of scope to use these systems as a sole way of measuring, taking these measurements and gathering information from, using them in tandem with some of the things that Astrid's probably going to tell you about next, and Sarah. So back to you, Ken.
Goodness me. Thank you, Paul. Let me just get the screen back. There we go. Thank you, Paul. You know, when Paul told me that you could measure climate change using the global positioning system, I said, I cannot believe you. And he has now given me much more things to think about. Remember that we're open for questions on the chat and at the end. And thank you so much, Paul. I really, I always learn stuff when I work with other people. What does that say about me? Let's move on from that.